A sweeping tribute to the late President George H.W. Bush captivated America and the world on Wednesday, with tributes from his family and friends who remember the gentleman statesman as a happy and optimistic man who sucked the marrow out of life. His casket was the centerpiece for a once-in-a-generation funeral, at times both soul-searing and hilarious, as he journeyed toward his final resting place. D.C.'s biggest bells tolled as pallbearers from every military service branch walked a somber cadence. Crosses and candles shared a procession with a single American flag. Alleluias rang out, led by a military chorus and the church's own choir, including children too young to have known any president named Bush. Former President George W. Bush, the late leader's most visible legacy, entered the cathedral last, taking his place with other family members in front pew across a well-worn aisle from President Donald Trump and every living former president. He was seen fighting back tears at the Capitol as his father's body left the building. A more stoic Bush stood at attention for his father along with more than 1,000 other black-clad Americans as 8 men in dress uniforms walked a rehearsed cadence and gently placed the coffin at the altar. A 21-gun salute, the week's fourth, had rung out an hour earlier, booming over a quiet, damp Washington morning at the Capitol. Soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines saluted their former commander-in-chief. Mourners lined the streets, and dignitaries from all over the world were on hand to see him arrive at a house of God. His stately cathedral memorial was held after a day and a half of lying in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, where Republicans and Democrats lined up for hours to pay their final respects. Historian John Meacham, author of a biography of the 41st president, said in the day's first eulogy that the senior Bush was America's last great soldier-statesman, a 20th-century founding father. He stood in the breach in the Cold War against totalitarianism. He stood in the breach in Washington against unthinking partisanship, Meacham said. He stood in the breach against tyranny and discrimination. In a moment that could be interpreted as a jab at President Trump, seated just yards away, he said, on his watch, a wall fell in Berlin. Meacham noted, too, Bush's signature on the Americans with Disabilities Act, saying doors across America opened to millions as a result. Like George Washington, John Adams, and Harry Truman, Meacham said, Bush believed in causes larger than themselves. Meacham also made George W. Bush laugh. Recalling the elder Bush campaigning furiously, he said the future president once grasped the hand of a mannequin by mistake. He said, "Never know." Gotta ask, Meacham deadpanned. He quoted Saturday Night Live comedian Dana Carvey explaining his success portraying the then-president, saying it was Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne, and chuckling along with the memory of a loving man with a big, vibrant, all-enveloping heart. Meacham remembered Bush's self-deprecation at his own malapropisms and awkward turns of phrase. Fluency in English is not something I'm often accused of. Former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney praised Bush, a friend for decades, as a resolute and determined president whom foreign leaders respected. Every single head of government in the world knew that they were dealing with a gentleman, a genuine leader, he said. A century from now, he declared, it will be said that in the life of this country, the United States, which is in my judgment the greatest democratic republic that God has placed on this earth, I believe it will be said that no occupant of the Oval Office was more courageous, more principled and more honorable. But he also had a delightful sense of humor and was a lot of fun. Remembering Bush's first NATO meeting, he described a lengthy, plodding address by Iceland's leader. The smaller the country, Bush told him later, the longer the speech. Retired Wyoming Senator Alan Simpson, known as a jokester during his Washington years, had Bush the younger cracking broad grins and laughing. He told a story that filled in a historical gap from the 1992 campaign, when George H.W. Bush was struggling amid low poll numbers and trying to save his hopes of a second term. "Remember Lincoln, going to his knees in times of trial in the Civil War and all that stuff?" he asked a group of insurance workers in Dover, New Hampshire. "You can't be. And we're blessed. So don't feel sorry don't cry for me, Argentina." The press then wrote that he was finally losing his marbles, Simpson recalled, talking about Bush's sudden lapse into an Andrew Lloyd Webber lyric. But he and Bush and their wives, he said, had attended a concert of Webber hits 2 nights earlier, and sang the Evita tune all the way back to 1600 Avenue. President Donald Trump sat alongside three former Democratic presidents, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, a tribute to the man for whom they showed varying degrees of contempt and admiration while he was alive. Trump has been consistently critical of the late Bush for his military adventurism and regime change policies in the Persian Gulf and Panama, which he believes sacrificed too much American blood and treasure for minimal return. He even mocked Bush's 1,000 Points of Light volunteerism program this summer, claiming his Make America Great Again slogan provided a better, more aspirational vision. But following Friday's death of Bush at age 94, the current president treated Americans to a kinder, gentler Trump. "We lost a president who truly was a wonderful person, a wonderful man, a great man," he told reporters in Argentina during the G20 summit. On Wednesday he proclaimed the cathedral service not a funeral. "This is a day of celebration for a great man who has led a long and distinguished life. He will be missed." Trump sat in the front row but didn't offer a eulogy. Former Florida Gov. Jeb Bush said Tuesday that former President George W. Bush had dibs. Other eulogists included Alan Simpson, the former senator from Wyoming, Brian Mulroney, the former Canadian Prime Minister who also spoke at Ronald Reagan's funeral, and presidential historian John Meacham, who wrote a Bush biography. Clinton owed many of his successes to Bush's groundwork, including a NATO expansion, Middle East peace talks and the North American Free Trade Agreement, which historians view as an impossibility without Bush's optimistic cajoling in prior years. Trump now views all three as failures of leadership, seeing weakness where modern Democrats see calculated restraint and humility. Obama generally admired Bush as more Democratic than Republican, especially for his widely panned willingness to raise taxes and what he called a Hippocratic approach to foreign policy. Obama awarded him the Medal of Freedom in 2011, but America's first black president privately groused in his White House about Bush's appointment of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, a conservative African-American whom he believed undermined civil rights. George H.W. Bush is the only former president Jimmy Carter hasn't swiped at during his post-presidency. Even Obama drew his ire for ordering drone strikes against Middle Eastern terrorists, and for failing to shutter the Guantanamo Bay military prison camp. He lionized Bush on Saturday for his grace, civility, and social conscience. The late president's remains began the weekend in Houston. Family members accompanied the casket to Washington on a plane that typically serves as Air Force One. In a hushed quiet that's rare in America's bustling Capitol complex, Bush lay in state while dignitaries and family passed underneath the towering Capitol dome. An estimated 57,000 people joined them, one by one. 95-year-old Bob Dole, a former senator and, like Bush, an undisputed World War II hero, made the most dramatic silent statement, rising from his wheelchair for a moment, determined to stand just long enough to salute his fallen comrade. George W. Bush and former First Lady Laura Bush surprised mourners Tuesday night, returning for a second visit hours after the televised, polished arrival ceremony. Seeing a mother and child in the crowd, his eyes lit up and he was at once the all-smiles president Americans knew during the 8 months before the 9/11 terror attacks. He held the tiny girl aloft and posed for photos with his father's casket in the background, a tableau that spanned 5 generations and nearly a century of American history. A return trip 8 miles in the air aboard Special Mission 41 was scheduled for Wednesday afternoon after a Cadillac hearse bearing the seal of the President of the United States makes a slow drive past the White House. After a second public viewing in Houston, Texans will say their farewells at an Episcopal church service before Bush's flag-draped coffin is hoisted aboard a specialized Union Pacific train car for a 2.5-hour trip to the university town of College Station. That's the home of Texas A&M University, the site of Bush's presidential library. It is also the final resting place of his wife of 73 years, Barbara Bush, who died 8 months before him, and of Robin Bush, their daughter who died of leukemia before her 4th birthday. Bush's departure from the Capitol, where he once served in Congress for 4 years and occupied the office space now belonging to New York Democrat Hakeem Jeffries, Cannons boomed. A military band played Hail to the Chief. The members of the congressional leadership lined up outside to greet the Bush family when they arrived. Speaker Paul Ryan, Democratic Leader Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Senate Democratic Leader Chuck Schumer. Crowds of people lined Pennsylvania Avenue and waved to the motorcade of family members as they journeyed from Blair House, across the street from the White House, up to Capitol Hill. Two lines of soldiers, representing various branches of the armed forces, walked up the Capitol stairs to stand watch as the president's casket left for Washington National Cathedral and his funeral service there. The former president died on Friday at his home in Houston, Texas, aged 94 on Friday. He was brought to Washington, D.C. on Air Force One on Monday with his family. The ceremony drew together world envoys, Americans of high office and a guy from Maine who used to fix things in Bush's house on the water. All four living ex-presidents were in attendance, led by former President George W. Bush. The other eulogists were B. Alan Simpson, the former senator from Wyoming, Brian Mulroney, the former Canadian Prime Minister who also spoke at Ronald Reagan's funeral, and presidential historian John Meacham, who wrote a Bush biography. George H.W. Bush will be remembered as the man who oversaw the post-Cold War transition and led a successful Gulf War, before losing re-election in a generational shift to Democrat Bill Clinton in 1992. Among the guests was King Abdullah II and Queen Rania of Jordan, Britain's Prince Charles, Prince Abdullah bin Hamad Al Khalifa of Bahrain, Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany and Polish President Andrzej Duda. Rubbing shoulders with the dignitaries was Mike Lovejoy, a Kennebunkport electrician and fix-it man who has worked at Bush's Maine summer estate since 1990 and says he was shocked and heartened to be asked to come. On Tuesday, soldiers, citizens in wheelchairs and long lines of others on foot wound through the hushed Capitol Rotunda to view Bush's casket and honor a president whose legacy included World War II military service and a landmark law affirming the rights of the disabled. Former Senator Bob Dole, a compatriot in war, peace and political struggle, steadied himself out of his wheelchair and saluted his old friend and one-time rival. After the national funeral service at the cathedral, Bush's remains will be returned to Houston to lie in repose at St. Martin's Episcopal Church before burial Thursday at his family plot on the Presidential Library grounds at Texas A&M University in College Station. His final resting place will be alongside Barbara Bush, his wife of 73 years who died in April, and Robin Bush, the daughter they lost to leukemia in 1953 at age 3. Trump ordered the federal government closed Wednesday for a national day of mourning. Flags on public buildings are flying at half-staff for 30 days. As at notable moments in his life, Bush brought together Republicans and Democrats in his death.